Why is one strobe just a couple $100 and then another is a few thousand? Are you actually getting better light? Today, I'm going to talk about the differences of what makes a strobe more expensive and then if you really need that. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what you're really paying for when you invest in a more expensive strobe. When you're on a budget, like we all have been at some point, it can be tough to decide where you want to spend your money. Because the truth is, when it comes to strobes, they all flash. They're all going to light your subject. And for a lot of people, a relatively inexpensive option is probably going to do the trick. But I think it's important to know what you're sacrificing. What are you losing by not investing in a more expensive system? When you look a little deeper, there are a few key differences that can impact things like your shooting experience, your consistency, your control, your output, and therefore your final results. People often, when they hear expensive strobe, think that it means they're going to get better light. That is not really how it works. The look of your light is actually much more influenced by things like your modifier. Whether you're using a softbox or a beauty dish or a zoom reflector, that's what's shaping the light. That's what's controlling the softness, the feel of the image. So in many cases, I'm just totally honest, you can get a very similar look by using an affordable strobe if you're using a similar modifier and a similar setup. Now, I just want to say for the gear nerds out there, yes, technically there are differences depending on the design of the strobe and how the light is emitted and the design of certain modifiers, but in practice, that's not usually what's making the biggest visual difference. Now, by the way, if you have used an inexpensive and a pro system in the past, I want you to share what your favorite tools are and why, and I want to know, did you think the pro system was worth it? What were the benefits to you? I personally have found that the more expensive strobes, they become my choice not because the light is better looking per se, but for things that are, let's say, a little more tangential, like the consistency, the control that I get, the reliability. Those things to me as a pro are essential. So today what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk about some of the more nitty-gritty things of what you get from a more expensive strobe. And also to consider the things that you're sacrificing with a less expensive one, with a cheaper one. And maybe the things that you're losing doesn't matter at all to the way you shoot and what you're shooting. So the things we're going to cover are things like recycle time, misfire rate, flash duration, color consistency, power output and range, and build quality. So with that, let's dive in. Put simply, your recycle time is how quickly your strobe is ready to fire again after you just took a shot. This is one of those things that doesn't really matter until it really does, until it makes a huge difference. So let's envision that you're a photographer and you're photographing your subject dancing around, or maybe it's an athlete jumping and you're shooting a lot of frames quickly. If you have an inexpensive strobe with a slow recycle time, this means that your light literally isn't ready to shoot again when you click your shutter and you're going to miss your shot. So if you're shooting something like a standard headshot, you don't shoot a ton of frames in a row, this might not matter. But if you start adding some movement, maybe to the hair or some energy, it's going to make a huge difference. And trust me, you're going to be frustrated. Now, on my monthly educational platform, Learn Plus, each month I pick a different theme and I go through the detailed process of the shoot from the concepts, the lighting, and more. And in some of the episodes, my recycle time is essential, like life in motion or when I'm photographing dancers. So you want to make sure that whatever your concept is, that your lights can keep up. Now, manufacturers do list the recycle times in the specs for the strobes, but you really want to pay attention to the recycle time at full power. Since at low power, the light can kind of refill its power quickly, and so it's always going to be much faster. Higher end strobes tend to recycle extremely quickly, even at their highest outputs. Now, if you shoot motion and bursts and are shooting at high power, then recycle time is going to be really important to you. And if you're shooting static headshots, maybe not as much. During a typical shoot, how often are you taking a series of photos and then your strobe simply doesn't fire in some of the shots? Like, how many frames are you missing? This is one of those things that's kind of hard to evaluate because companies don't list their misfire rate. So you're kind of stuck relying more on things like real-world reviews from websites or YouTube channels, or do your own testing where you can actually see how often it misfires. This is one of the biggest and definitely frustrating differences between a low end and a high end strobe. Pro level systems, they have very few, if any, missed frames. And that's really important if you're shooting professionally. There's nothing worse than feeling like you missed the shot because the flash didn't fire. Now, there are actually a few things that increase misfire rates that actually don't have to do with the strobe itself. It's things like the quality of the trigger system, or if the batteries are low in your trigger, or sometimes there might actually be interference in the space that you're shooting. But higher end systems, their misfire rate drops dramatically. I've experienced this firsthand. That's part of what they are more expensive for. They want to make sure that you get the shot every shot. All right, next up, we're going to talk about something a little more technical called flash duration, which represents the ability of your strobe to freeze motion. Basically, what it means is how long is the flash actually on when it fires. Without going into too much detail here, the freezing of motion of your strobe is actually affected by how long that burst is. If it's really long, you're going to see a little bit of blur. High-end strobes, and honestly, even some mid-level strobes, they have fast flash durations, or they have dedicated freeze modes that make that flash just really, really short. Does this matter to you? If you're photographing dancers or moving hair or lots of action, this is something you'll probably want to look into, and the specifications are always listed by the manufacturer. But if you're shooting things like headshots or static subjects, it's probably something you don't need to worry about. And so this is an instance where a less expensive strobe probably will still do the trick. When I first started out, long ago, I began by using really inexpensive strobes, and the color consistency from image to image was horrible. So what do I mean by this is the color temperature and tint of the light that was coming from the strobe, it varied from shot to shot. It changed depending on how quickly I was shooting. It changed based on the power output that I was at. And now, to be fair, this was a long time ago, and technology has gotten a lot better. Most mid-range strobes, they're actually going to be pretty solid when it comes to color consistency. But as you might expect, if you invest in a higher-end strobe, the color is going to be extremely precise. For example, I have been at times forced to use a less expensive system where I'm shooting and I'm looking at the images and I'm like, wait, why is the rim light a different color than the main light? That's one of the things that I'm talking about when I say color consistency. Now, if that's happening to you, maybe you're a portrait photographer, this maybe doesn't bother you, or maybe it's not something that your client would even notice. But if you're doing something like color critical work or product photography, this is absolutely something you have to consider. Now, when you look at the strobe specifications, sometimes it'll be listed as a color temperature range. So for example, it'll have like a plus or minus Kelvin. Obviously, a small range is much better, and this is something that a pro level strobe is going to have a very, very small range, meaning it's extremely consistent. Next, you have to consider how much power output you need from your system. If you're shooting in a small, controlled space, you can often get away with relatively low-powered strobes. But if you're trying to do things like overpower bright ambient light, or shoot in a really big space, or you need a lot of depth of field for a group of people, you probably need significantly more output. Now, typically, when you need more power, it's usually going to cost more, at least within like a single brand. So for example, within that one brand, if you go up a stop in power, you'll probably see quite a bit of jump of cost. With higher end strobes, not only can you get more power output, but there's usually a wider range. In other words, you can turn the light up and down over more stops. So what this means is higher end strobes give you more flexibility. Even at the maximum output, you can then dial it down to really low power. So for example, let's look at one of my Profoto monolights, one of my higher end strobes. It has up to an 11 stop range, and many mid-level strobes have around 6 stops. So what this means is that I could take one strobe and it can be powerful enough to balance bright sunlight in the middle of the day, but then also that same strobe, it can be subtle enough, I can turn it down low enough to balance with low light at night. Personally, I prefer to have more power and more range, but for photographers shooting in a controlled environment, this probably isn't a big deal. Also, if you don't have enough power, you could compensate with your ISO or your aperture. But if you don't want to compromise and you want maximum flexibility, this is where the higher end options are really going to stand out. Professional strobes are designed to be used a lot. They're made with better materials, they have better cooling systems, they have more solid mounts, things like that. But if you're shooting occasionally and you're careful with your gear, maybe your build quality isn't as important to you. On the flip side, if you're using your gear all the time, you're traveling with it, or you rely on it for your paid work, build quality becomes something really important, something you need to think about. Now, some photographers, their approach is they want to buy something cheap, and then if it breaks, they'll buy a new one and a newer model. Others prefer to invest in quality, and that's kind of the camp that I'm in. I have strobes that I shoot multiple times a week and sometimes thousands of shots per day, and I've had them for years and they continue to work. When I invest in a strobe, that's what I expect, longevity. Now, obviously the things that I've covered are not the only things that make an expensive system more expensive. There are other considerations like the modifiers and the mounts and so much more. But we all know that at the end of the day, even the most basic, inexpensive strobe and inexpensive modifier in the hands of a skilled photographer, they can still make incredible work. So that might lead you to ask, well, then why spend thousands when you can spend hundreds? Well, it's the consistency and the speed and the reliability and the control and the output, the things we've just talked about. And if those things are not critical to how you shoot, then a more affordable option may be completely fine. It may not change the actual look at your images at all. Your experience, your practice, and your careful eye, that's what makes the difference in the end result. But as your shots become more demanding, as your career grows, the stakes get higher, the shots become unmissable, that's where reliability becomes essential. And those differences, they may start to matter a lot more. I've linked my favorite professional studio gear in the description below if you want to check out the tools that I've come to rely upon as a professional. And if you decide to pick up some of that gear, visit Adorama.com. And by the way, I've also linked you to my educational membership platform, Learn Plus. If you want to see me get creative and push my pro level gear to the max, watch it keep up with my fast-paced creativity. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.